I am now here with two of my favorite cultural critics. You know Eileen Jones as the film critic at Jacobin, and of course, Catherine Liu, our friend Catherine Liu, author of the book Virtue Hoarders. It's great to see you both.
Hi,
Good
lovely
to
to be
see
here.
you.
So, I wanted to have you both on to talk about culture, broadly speaking. And specifically, I think that there's kind of a sense right now that culture is sort of worse than ever, right? And that, we're sort of inundated with, just the worst dregs of mass culture, pop culture, and just, things aren't as good as they used to be. So I want to put this question over to both of you because there's part of me that absolutely agrees and feels that way as well. I think movies right now are awful, but at the same time, I also recognize that this sort of seems to be a feeling that like critics of every generation have, right?
Yeah.
So, our patron saint of having a bad attitude, Theodore Adorno, famously complained about movies in the 1940s. He has a famous line where he's like, "Every time I go to the cinema, I leave like even stupider than I was before," or something like that, right?
I don't know what he expected.
Right.
That was just a question of expectations.
Yeah. So, I want to open it up to both of you. Maybe we'll start with you, Eileen,
Yeah.
because I do have to mention, I feel like if, you write regularly for Jacobin, you do
Yes.
movie reviews for Jacobin, and honestly, like I read all of them, and most of your reviews are negative, right?
Definitely.
Yeah.
But-
so
That's where we get into that tricky question of when did things get really bad?
Right.
Because in my adult lifetime, and I come of age in the 80s, 1980s, that was a ghastly decade. And I feel like I've always been used to trying to find the gems in the garbage dump of American culture. So I think I've always felt that the vast majority of stuff produced is dreck.
Yeah.
With the exception, we occasionally have exciting movements. There's certainly always exciting filmmakers to be found. But the majority of stuff, it's going to suck, especially 80s and on. For me, that's the decade when it all goes bad. My question is, when are you saying it was good? It sounds like you have a more recent idea of when it was good.
Well, I'm interested in you kind of marking the 80s as the turning point. Why do you think that is? Is it just Reagan or?
Oh, a huge amount, I think.
Yeah.
The doldrums begins in my memory anyway. This is personal. A malaise setting in the late 70s that, of course, I couldn't identify. I was too young. But I could already feel like an increasing level of like hopelessness for anyone who wasn't a raging right-winger. And things just were happening in cinema that are noted in history as being, this is probably not the best model. We go into that horrible tentpole blockbuster model where everything gets thrown at a couple of huge releases per year, and then that supports the rest of your slate. But, this is the era of the agent coming to the fore and turning into a de facto producer. And you've got packaging as your leading way to make movies in Hollywood. You have the bright spot of like independent film that lasts for a very short time, where it's exciting. New filmmakers coming from nowhere can make a film, take it to a festival, be discovered, have major careers, the Coen brothers, Spike Lee, and many, many others. But it's such a little bright spot in a horrific decade when more and more movies start looking like television, for one thing, because the ancillary markets are where it's at. So people just start saying, why do a lovely, composed, detailed image? No one's going to see it on an airplane or whatever. So for me, at multiple levels, the 80s, everything goes into the damn toilet. Plus, we're coming out of a really exciting era film-wise. 60s, 70s is just an explosion of creativity.
Catherine, when did culture die? Was it the 80s?
I have a slightly different take, but I agree mostly with Eileen. I mean, part of my feeling about this is, why does it matter that culture is bad? We live in a bad world. That was also Adorno's thing. Like,
Right.
There's no good art in a bad world. So, but I like to blame Harvey Weinstein and the Weinstein brothers, because when they when they decided that they could take independent film big, is when the independent movement really started to cater to the Weinstein's taste, which was like halfway softcore porn, little exoticism, like Water for Chocolate was their big breakthrough. They were big rock and roll producers before then, and they were visionary in that they saw this opening in the 70s, 80s transition into where we were looking at more reactionary times, but there were also more yuppies looking for a kind of cosmopolitan, self-congratulatory point of view. And so they went to festivals. They picked up like Water for Chocolate, which, whatever you think, I think it's a bad movie, but it's very exoticizing. It sort of sets the tone for like Latin American softcore cinema with food and the exotic abuela. Like Encanto actually owes a lot to like Water for Chocolate. And then everyone wanted to chase the Weinstein brothers' magical formula because they were able to take these small films, promote the shit out of them, and get Oscars. And so it really changed. I mean, Entourage does this great job of showing how Sundance, which had used to be a sort of incubator for, visionary young filmmakers, has become like a meat market for Harvey Weinstein, basically. One of the specific things that I think happens when you can see very, very carefully what happens is two people came out of independent film, Tarantino and Allison Anders, were discovered by Weinstein at the same time. My memory is going. So I think it was like early 90s. And Tarantino, of course, has this big blockbuster career. Allison Anders makes a beautiful film, Gas Lodging something. And
Gas
it's
Food
really,
Lodging.
Gas Food Lodging, realistic, working class, all female story. And, to the Weinstein's credit, they bought that film and they released it. But then she was completely overshadowed by the huge thing that Tarantino became. And so, we can blame the Weinstein brothers for a lot of things, but I think the destruction of independent art cinema is one of them. And then, of course, like media consolidation. Sony Pictures comes in and they start to buy up everything because the Japanese have all this extra cash. And then that sort of sets up the model for this kind of like seamless consolidation. Now, isn't like ESPN, Disney, ABC like one giant conglomerate now?
Right. Yeah.
The
Disney
more
owns
you have,
everything.
Yeah. Exactly.
so the more you have this kind of oligarchy becoming the way and the being of mass cultural production, the worse it is. But to give a plug for certain things, not to say that they're all bad, is that recently I rewatched, because I was writing the introduction to the German translation of my book, Footloose from 1984, which is really, really popular in Germany, especially post-Berlin Wall Germany. And that's actually an incredible piece of cinema. It's kind of genius. So one, culture doesn't matter. How can you expect good culture in a bad world? Two, it's the Weinstein brothers' fault. And three, Footloose is an amazing movie.
Fair enough. I think something that you both are getting at is that there's kind of like a material basis to everything sucking, right? And on that note, I want to show you guys a clip, a Matt Damon clip, because he has a kind of a related take on this too. So let's watch this, and then I'm going to get your thoughts.
So I think a scenario lots of viewers can relate to is sitting on the couch on a Friday night, going through the streaming services, cycling through the movies and thinking to themselves, they're not making movies for me anymore. As somebody who's been intimately involved in movie making for 30 years, what are the macro Hollywood conditions behind that sentiment?
Well, so what happened was the DVD was a huge part of our business, of our revenue stream. And technology has just made that obsolete. And so the movies that we used to make, you could afford to not make all of your money when it played in the theater because you knew you had the DVD coming behind the release. And 6 months later, you'd get a whole nother chunk. It would be like reopening the movie almost. And when that went away, that changed the type of movies that we could make. I did this movie Behind the Candelabra, and I talked to a studio executive who explained it was a $25 million movie. I would have to put that much into print and advertising, right, to market it, what we call P&A. So I'd have to put that in P&A. So now I'm in $50 million. I have to split everything I get with the exhibitor, right, the people who own the movie theaters. So I would have to make $100 million before I got into profit. And the idea of making $100 million on a story about like this love affair between these two people, yeah, I love everyone in the movie, but that's suddenly a massive gamble. in a way that it wasn't in the 1990s when they were making all those kind of movies, the kind of movies that I loved and the kind of movies that were my bread and butter.
All right. So again, I think that he kind of touches on some of the same themes that you both were bringing up. And this sort of raises the question of like, what is, I guess, the relationship of capitalism to art, right? Because there's a lot of truth to what he's saying. But at the same time, like when I was watching that, I was also thinking like, for example, like, I think that we all can agree that the profit motive and that capitalism undermines art in some very serious ways. But at the same time, like, I don't think you can convince me that, for instance, the social democracies of Scandinavia are necessarily producing better art than Americans, right? I mean, I don't know.
Wait, I'll fight you on that.
I know. I knew that Catherine would have something to say.
Okay, no.
But no. Yeah. I mean, we should talk about the Scandinavian art in a minute. But maybe Eileen, what are your thoughts on the Matt Damon model?
Well, I mean, who can blame him? He's in the middle of it. I mean, I wish he wasn't so self-serious. I want to like him so much, and he's just getting more and more pompous every day. But never mind all that. He's in the midst of business models coming up that seem obviously awful. I mean, like, I would point to the recent Netflix move to get big budget franchises that are really mediocre, like Gray Man or Day Shift. And they just throw a lot of Hollywood stars at it to get eyes on it, I guess. And they're pretty terrible. But this seems to be something that a ton of money is being thrown at as an experiment for how they can go forward. As, whole theater chains are going into bankruptcy, and God knows where we're going to see movies at all outside our homes pretty soon. So, but on the other hand, the whole history of Hollywood is just capitalism, like with a capital C. So if you're looking at the whole history of it, good eras, bad eras, whatever eras, you're always looking at what are the latest ugly commercial choices that anyone who's ambitious is either having to fight or find clever ways to take advantage of, or whatever it is, however people are surviving. There's a good reason that major political film movements rejected Hollywood out of hand. Just said, that's absolutely what we're not doing in any way. We're not doing production like them, or distribution or exhibition. We're doing everything completely non-Hollywood, because Hollywood is just evil capitalism writ large. So again, it's a little tricky. It's almost a disadvantage to know film history, because you're just like, this thing again. It's another bad business model that kills art. It's always been.
Catherine, any thoughts on Matt Damon?
No, I mean, he's like playing the beautiful soul. It's okay. I think it is interesting what he's saying. I think it's more the DVD probably killed art. The small art house cinema that Eileen and I used to go to. I mean, Jen, you're probably too young, but there were movie theaters when we were young that would run, like, say, an Almodovar film for 6 months. And it would build word of mouth, and they knew that they could make the money because people would go see Law of Desire and then tell their friends to go see Law of Desires at the Thalia. But, we know what happened to that kind of platform. The thing that I wanted to say was, like, making good art is incredibly hard. It's also incredibly rare. And there's no guarantee that in any social democracy, you're going to have like good art necessarily. But once again, I'm going to come back to it. What does it matter? If people are able, I think it's much more important that artists are able to make a living and live without catastrophizing, without like fear of medical catastrophe or something. But I'm thinking of two different moments where really, really good art was made. And they were almost like historically contingent moments. The French New Wave in the late 50s to early 60s, and the Taiwanese New Wave in the 80s to the 90s. And if you look at how much those schools of film actually changed filmmaking, you'll see that a lot of the decisions that were made was because they didn't have enough money. There were lots of things but one of the things that also was really powerful was that there was affordable urban housing. There was an explosive economic growth. There was incredible optimism in the middle class, even as France was being integrated into the global economy. Taiwan is being integrated in the global economy. And you have enough like surplus profit for these young middle class, they were mostly men, to live and talk about films, to actually live it. One of my favorite things about Hou Xiaoxian's interviews about that time was that one, he was friends with a bunch of writers and other filmmakers, and they didn't really know what they were doing. He was making really commercial stuff for television. And then when he got a 16 to 35 millimeter camera, he said, you know, we had to do one take because I didn't have enough film. I couldn't afford film. And so he said, I would just set up the camera at the end of an alley and let things, you know, happen as people moved in and out of the frame. That became like, you know, his long take is like one of the great aesthetic achievements. It's a tribute to Ozu, and everyone can say all these great things about it. But when you read it about it, it was really about constraint, improvisation, and also like just his trusting this community of artists who were also actors, writers who were also actors. So you have this kind of like incredible synergy, and everyone says now, you know, that's over. And the young Taiwanese filmmakers themselves are like, oh, we're so tired of hearing about those people. And, you know, we're doing something new. They're making more sort of both, like, I would say, you know, politically correct cinema, but also more blockbustery cinema, with the exception of a few pioneers. But that moment has gone. And there's a lot of resentment of the fact that that moment has disappeared. But the material conditions of that has to do with like the French National Film Board supported French productions in the 50s and 60s. And there was a quota system about what could be shown in theaters. The Taiwanese, it was called the China Picture Company, Chinese Picture Corporation. The Taiwanese government supported filmmaking and also supported this is really interesting, the bringing in of films to theaters in Taipei, because they wanted to show the world that Taipei was a modern city. And so one of the things to do was to build film theaters and also import a lot of films, and so and support local filmmakers. So this is also that was a critical aspect of how these groups of young people could actually afford to sit around all day and talk about a movie, develop a script, you know, get on the shoot. Sorry. So that was a really long answer to your question.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think is right that kind of a welfare state and arts funding and support from the government. It's not that it necessarily produces good art; it just produces more art. And I'm sure there are like a ton of bad like Taiwanese new wave movies that we don't watch anymore. You know, that also came out of that time period. But it also produced, you know, Tsai Ming Liang. So.
Well, yeah, if I could just add a couple of points. Yeah. I don't quite understand the whole what does it matter about art when we're talking longingly about if only there were the conditions to create great. I'm baffled. So that I've spent my whole life longing for the Bohemias that I missed and that I don't see. So there's that. But there's also this equation of art with art house cinema and independent film. And maybe because I was in independent film, I don't feel nearly as reverent. I saw just as much god-awful formula crap, coming-of-age drama stuff as I have seen, you know, in supposedly formula Hollywood filmmaking or commercial filmmaking internationally. I love so many of those films. I think there was so much of people producing great art in genres. So I don't think I like that split.
Right. No, I agree. No, Eileen, thank you for the corrective. I don't have this like terrible reverence for it. I teach your genre book. I love genre film. I teach genre film all the time. I'm just talking about like moments when there was what I thought really good films that were being made, you know, in en masse in a small group of people. I think that's really important. So why do I say like, what does good culture matter? Of course it matters to people like us. But I'm talking about like in the bigger picture, like that shouldn't be our priority at this point. The culture is so bad right now, mass and art house cinema. People love Steve McQueen. I loathe those films. I know it's a horrible cancel me now.
Oh, do you?
But yeah, I do. Small Axe. I hated that whole series. but it's because, in a way, I feel like a lot of both mainstream and art cinema, and you're absolutely right about this, Eileen, and I tend to go in that direction, so you pull me back. But they think of, if we think of film as the medium, then, and it's in prose, it's in every single cultural medium right now. They think of it, the cultural medium, as a message carrier.
Right.
And so for me, this is my, old formalist thing that aligns with genre. I don't want art to be a carrier of a message.
Right.
I want it to have formal cohesion and actual historical knowledge about its genre. There are so many people coming out of MFA programs, and in the United States especially, who don't read. I mean, they admitted this on Twitter. There's a whole really funny thread about it. But it's like, I don't have time to read. And it's so ableist to say that people who are writers should be readers because I have ADHD or something. And I'm like, oh my God, we're producing a generation of people who are, or it's been generations like this already, where you don't have any respect for historical precedents. So in that way, I'm pretty nerdy. I mean, one of the things I love about the Coen brothers is every film you watch of theirs is steeped in film.
Yeah.
And film knowledge. But you don't have to have any of it to appreciate them. But the more you know, the more deeply appreciative you are of their films. So yes, it matters to us, but should it matter in the larger world? I'm not sure. And two, if you think of your film as a carrier of a message, I don't want to see it.
Right.
No, I just don't want to see it.
I do want to get into this idea of the film as a carrier of a message, because obviously this is a political show and this is something that comes up a lot. But before that, something that I think you both have been talking about is counterculture, right? Or I mean, rather, our conversation has been, I think, mostly focused on mass culture. But how do you guys see counterculture and or subculture as operating right now? I guess what I'm getting at is, someone like Thomas Frank sort of points out that there's always been a kind of deep entanglement between corporate culture and counterculture, more of an entanglement than people like to think. But on the other hand, I think that we still have a lot of people on the left who see building counterculture, an artistic counterculture, as an important project. And maybe this gets at the kind of division between, the mainstream movie and the art house movie, if such a division really even is that stable. So what is the role of counterculture today? Or maybe the larger question is, does such a thing exist, right?
Does it? It's... You tell me, Catherine. You're probably keeping up more.
No,
is there one?
I feel like it's all become like niche markets. Counterculture is just a niche market.
And is that because of the internet? Follow up.
Oh, that's one possibility, but it's also because of the the new economy, the unaffordability of urban places. Eileen and I were both drop kicked out of New York, out of the Bohemian Utopia. Look at Williamsburg. It looks like Berlin. Berlin wants to be Williamsburg. There's this thin crust of internet bohemian, or new economy bohemians that travel the world on this very thin crust of marketing. Okay, that's grim, but
yeah, it's just hard to see how. I hate to get into any kind of how can you blame anyone. There's just how to get a footing, how to get any traction, how to build any kind of a sizable audience is the question. People, there's so much niche. There's so many people who, this is already passé, but my godsons used to try to persuade me to watch YouTube just by the hour. And I never could get it. It was a true generational break. I was just like, I'll occasionally see something, but I don't know how you can spend hours and hours and hours. And for me, that was really about the loss of form and a certain, as you were mentioning, Catherine, and a certain idea of what art would be or could be. There has to be some sort of reverence for form. And when in an era where there seems to be none, and I'm just going by my most, I'm retired now, but teaching at Berkeley in the film department, my last years were just, it it was hopeless practically. And I'm a pretty good teacher. But all the stuff that I used to always concentrate on, like the basics of cinematography editing, I'd have my peers, fellow, teachers saying, I hear you teach things like about cinematography and stuff. Do you do that? And I'd be like, you don't do that? Don't you mention the angle, the lighting, the color scheme, the editing? No. And the answer would be no. So there's a kind of loss of investment in the very idea, I think, even among those who are claiming this is my field of study, this is what I care about. And as for the history, forget it. When I was an undergraduate getting into film, I already knew it. My friends and I prided ourselves on having strong opinions on different figures of silent cinema. We were already ready. We were there. We were that last generation that really bought into an investment in cinema that was like that. The students I was teaching, it almost never happened by the end. It just wasn't a thing. It was people who liked films of their own era that were mainstream and really, even in a film studies program, were much more interested in some form of production. God knows how they were going to ever get into it. It's a more and more impossible field to enter. So there's a breakdown on so many levels that as I was trying to grapple with some of the questions we were addressing, I was just like, I don't even know where to begin.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to ask Jen what she means. As a young person, tell me, what do you mean?
Well, maybe now let's go back to this question of like the film as like a carrier of a message, right? Because that's a really big thing.
Can I just intervene a little bit and respond to Eileen? I mean, because she, brought me off my art house high horse. I just want to say that I want to tell you the story about when I welcomed the new class coming into film and media studies, and I said, this is 2017, and I said something like, and here we're going to see a variety of films, and they're not going to be the Transformers. Mm-hmm. And, I finished the welcome and I was leaving, and one of the new students came up to me and said, Professor Liu, this is so exciting. I'm so excited to be here. He was an Afro-Caribbean guy from Belize. And he said, but my first film was the Transformers. That was the first film I saw. And I was so in love with that film. And it gave me an idea of what was possible in film. And I dragged my parents to see it. And I was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. Of course.
Right.
My son loved those films too. And so I was like, okay, well, this is the end. This is your entry. This is the portal for you to enter into. And he was like one of our best students, became a real cinephile. So I don't want to be like, oh my God, these young people, they know nothing.
I know, where it's very, Grandpa Simpson, old man yells at cloud stuff.
Yeah, I don't want to do that.
That we don't want to do.
That was a real lesson. Like for me, that was a real what do you call it? Learnable moment or whatever. Teachable moment.
Yeah.
But it still does leave open a question of like what, I mean, I guess this is a segue, but what do we want to teach in film programs?
Right.
Which have proliferated all over the landscape to a mad degree. I mean, what even is the curriculum? It seemed to be breaking down pretty strongly as I was leaving, at least in my own opinion. But again, I'm old school.
Yeah. Well, maybe you could talk a little bit about how it was breaking down and whether it relates to this other thing that, has come up, which is this idea that the film should be a carrier of a message, and also that the cultural production is like an important site of political struggle or something.
Oh my God, it just got harder and harder to not to present the same lesson plans and try to get the same discussions going, but to get any interest, to get past glazed eyes, which again, I prided myself in being a very passionate and entertaining professor. So it was getting very hard by the end. I mean, one of the things I noticed that I hardly knew how to address, an investment in plot like I had never seen in my life. Mm-hmm. And analysis for many students had become more details of the plot, and to try to get that shift over to, no, it's not what is being presented, like endless story points, but how it is being presented given the nature of the medium, blah, blah, blah. You got to start more from there to try to arrive. And it was getting harder all the time. And I think that has matched a lot of, at least, what we see in TV series, is just that the binge experience, and certainly I can get into it, heaven knows, is front loading absolute tons of plot, which is Stranger Things that's what it is. It's just such an insane glut of plot that when you're done you can't remember any of it, or at least I can't. So there was a phenomena of moving not even to the old thing Susan Sontag complained about in Against Interpretation. We're digging past form to content and meaning as if that's the art. And she's like, you don't dig for the form is the art. So that was her, big complaint, which she was writing in the early 60s and hoping film would be spared, which is pretty funny, that analytical process, which it wasn't. So that definitely had become my experience even as early as grad school. I was finding, oh no, people are not interested. They were telling me essentially, you should be a film critic, Eileen, because you don't belong in the academy. And they were so right, because I was not interested particularly in high theory, and I certainly wasn't interested in digging into cinema as symptomatic of what ails the culture and all that. At least not as a rule. Yeah. So that was just a huge dominant phase for me. But as I was leaving, I was finding that there was even a shift away from that theory. The whole grand narrative theory, as everyone knows, started to break down, 90s and 2000s, and fall apart as a dominant mode of pedagogy. And you got into this strange. The investment in plot is so enormous that it's like that's where the art is. So if you've ever talked to anyone who's very invested in the Marvel Comics universe, that's what you will hear. It's just so much plot you can't even believe. Right. And it's all in this intense, and then so-and-so is still mad about what happened in the Civil War, right. And therefore blah, 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 blah. And it's incredible, the investment is wild. Yeah. So again, I'm doing Old Man Yells at Cloud. Sorry, but it was just a very striking thing in my last couple of years of teaching, because it was getting very, very intense. Not like every student, but it is a kind of dominant mode of ways of looking at film that they were coming in with, students more and more. I was up against new phenomena that I wasn't quite sure what to make of.
Catherine, any additional thoughts on how film criticism or film analysis has changed?
Film analysis. Just, this is all like war stories, but there was one year when I realized while I was teaching that none of my students read any film criticism.
Yes.
We looked at Rotten Tomatoes.
That's right.
And it was like, oh, wow. That really, that was really enlightening. But I do want to say one thing, like, I feel so much more comfortable teaching film now, because I used to I grew up in an immigrant household. We were media deprived. So I always felt like I was very, very behind on cinema. And there would always be one person in my class who like ran a video store. And they'd be like, well, did you see this film in 1933 by blah, blah, blah?
Right.
Did you know that Dean Stockwell was a child actor in 1957? Blah, 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 blah. And I'd be like, no. And so I feel really disempowered. So yay, internet. I'm that populist person too, which is like, what? But there was this kind of like obscure knowledge thing from the like video rental store guy that I hated on some deep level, but they felt like they own film. And so now no one really owns the moving image anymore. And that in a way is very liberating. So I do want to say that. Going back to the thing about the YouTube streaming, what's so interesting was that there was this moment when people were like, oh, this is like avant-garde cinema again. It's short cinema. It's like demanding different kinds of attention. I'm like, oh my God. Because I grew, I raised a young man during this period of time. I'm like, really? You're going to, like my academic colleagues, I was like, you're going to say like, this is queering the narrative or whatever, or, the avant-garde is on YouTube now. Like, have you ever actually just sat there for 8 hours watching someone play a video game and listening to like the jokes they're making? It is entertaining. Like I can see what it's, but there's no like formal integrity anymore. So I actually think there's like a polarized, like liberal superego thing making, media a vehicle for their messages, like pounding our heads with a 2x4 about the correct line on things. And then there's this incredible content production that is just all about like creating just provocation, reaction, also shared spaces of fantasy that come out of D&D. It's very male. It's where some 4chan alt-light culture comes out of, but it's like there are two different streams of audiovisual production right now, and they almost don't have anything to do with each other. And maybe that's where the real counterculture is now, which we don't really want to think about, which is the streamer world. It's the difficult to watch, demands commitment, demands initiation, creates a clear inside and outside. And that's what countercultures are.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.